understand it and become passionate about giving that defense for our faith. Father, we lift this up in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you. All right, so last week, and our kids, by the way, in case you hear them going crazy, they're getting ice cream tonight. It's their, like, all year they've been, or all semester they've been memorizing scripture, and they get points for it. And depending on how many verses they memorized, how often they were here, and whether they brought their Bible or their books and things like that, they get to accumulate points and then buy ice cream and toppings and like it's like for every
Bible bribery.
5 points they get 1 scoop of ice cream, and then they can buy brownies or cookies or bananas or strawberries and all that stuff for the top. So they're going to be jacked up by the end of this.
And send them home to their parents.
Yes. They're jacked up now. This is normal, but then they'll really get it later. They're watching a movie, so maybe they'll be calm. But if you hear them go crazy, it's always fun when you get like PJ here. Because PJ he's great at scripture memory. He does all of his work really well. And last time, I mean, he got like 5 scoops of ice cream, 2 or 3 brownies. Like, it was just overflowing, and he actually had to stop halfway through. He said, I can't. He gave it to his sister. She tried to tackle it, but she had her own ice cream, so it was pretty fun. All right. So last week we talked about why we do apologetics, which is great for motivation. I mean, hopefully you, as we went through that, you were able to see what the goals of it were and how it strengthens our faith and how it can lead to evangelism and hopefully open some of those doors of opportunity to speak to other people. But for me, the 2 things that stand out about why we do it is, yes, to engage those who don't believe, to get some commonality for those who are maybe opposed to Christianity, more the outward atheists. But then the second is just, I think it strengthens my own walk at times when I think back. So is this whole thing we're doing ridiculous? If you've ever had those, I mean, there's crises of faith that you go through in your walk probably, and sometimes this helps strengthen that and say, no, what I have is true. It's not a made-up thing. Like, there's support behind this. I was reminded of this week. Did any of you watch Dill or No Dill, the season?
Yes.
Like it coming back on. You remember Dill or No Dill from back 10 years ago? It started up again this year, and it was Monday night, I think. Mm-hmm. And season premiere, and they had a guy, and if you don't, have all of you seen it? You know the premise? Like, choose a suitcase. He chose one, and he was going on, and he said, I mean, you got a choice of 50 suitcases. He chose one, and he said, $1 million is in there. He said, I believe. Like, we thought about it. We picked our numbers a few days ago. We know, like, I believe this is my $1 million suitcase. And one of the first cases he opened from the crowd was $1 million. So it clearly wasn't $1 million, but he had $750,000 left up on there, and so he kept saying, no, it's the 750. I believe. We have faith that this suitcase contains this money. He said, we know it. And it came down to, he had his case and one other. There was, I think, $10 or $5. Okay, $5. It could either, there were 2 suitcases left, his and one other, and one of them had $5, one of them had $750,000. And he said, it came down to it, and the banker makes an offer and says, I'll give you $350,000 to walk away, which any intelligent person would do because it's a 50-50 shot versus a guaranteed $350,000. And he said, no. He said, I believe. He kept repeating that over and over, and I kept thinking about this and thinking, and last night at dinner we used it as an object lesson for the kids and saying, like, that's completely not what faith is. Right. That is ignorance. That's believing. That's claiming something with no support for it. And that's so often what people think that Christians are doing when we say we're supposed to have faith in God. And that's not. I don't have faith in God because I think that He exists or because I think that this case has $750,000. No, he got $5. He walked away with $5.
What was his statement then?
I believe
He gambled. He
I
was
believe I
He
was
said,
wrong.
I mean,
Yeah.
and his wife was supporting him. His mom was like, "You idiot," but
Mom's always
And
right.
she was right.
yeah, and she was. But I thought, what a great picture of what faith really is. I mean, faith is not saying that this has money in it, because that's absent of any truth. When you know truth, that's what we have. That's what Christianity is about. And so we talked about that. That's what apologetics does, is it just gives more and more proof, which strengthens the faith. It's not that it makes it where we don't have to have faith. It just makes it stronger and more confident. We used the chair illustration last week for it. But now I want to transition away from why we do it or how we do it to what we'll actually do. And to me, this is the fun stuff, because I'm built weird, I guess. I like these philosophical arguments and these thoughts. Like, how would I actually engage someone with this? If I had a person who said there was no God, who said, I don't believe in your Bible, and I'm pointing, it says Jesus lived and he died for you, and they say, well, I disregard that. There is no God. I don't believe in your Bible. I believe it's made up. What do I say to them? And what is my response going to be to actually have that conversation? And I have two options. I can choose to engage in an intellectual conversation and spiritual conversation, or I can say, forget about it, I don't know, and brush them off. I can, as I said, my student said, shake the dust off and walk away from them, which is, I don't think, a biblical mandate at all. We need to try and engage those people, so we need to be responsible with it. So how do we do that? What's the first step? We talked about last week that, pointing to the Bible doesn't work unless you believe the Bible's true, and it's hard to prove that the Bible's true unless you do some research into it, and even if it's true, what makes it authoritative? Is there a God? And for me, I believe one of the best ways is to start with the argument for God before I get to the Bible. Some others have done it in a different way, and they start with the Bible to prove that there's a God. I think that requires some hurdles that are more challenging to get over, and if you can get people to understand that there is a God, accept that there's a God, then it makes it a little bit more obvious to go to, okay, now there's a Bible, and there's such things as miracles, and Jesus could have raised from the dead. And so I always start with, I think we should start with God. So that's what we're going to do today. This is on page, we're going to look at 3 arguments for the existence of God. And I'm going to run through these. There's a lot to cover. I don't think we'll get through it all. So we may have to have one more night of this, some futuristic time period. But we'll get through what we can. So let's look at this idea of whether there is a God. Some quotes that individuals have said. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why? It's not going. That's not telling you what my screen says.
It's stuff.
It's stuck. Hold on. Okay. This is what happens. Like I said, oh, I'm not connected. That's why.
If you take that sticker off in front of the computer, it'll probably work better.
I don't think so.
New way. Hey, you.
We'll see.
Then we'll only work about half the time.
If you want it to be really good, you need to.
Take a little more.
I had spent glasses one. My legs are still feeling it.
There we go. All right. Now we can switch.
Sooner or later.
There we go. All right. So, I think that's an interesting idea. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why did anything come into existence? And he's got nice hair. So that's something.
Wilhelm Leibniz.
Yeah. Martin Heidegger said, why do we have something rather than nothing at all? He just plagiarized, I think. But said that's a fundamental question of metaphysics. And so when we have that, we really have 4 questions, or 4 possible options, rather, of why things do exist. Why is there reality around us? Why are there plants, animals, humans? Why is the earth here? you have four options to choose from. One is that reality is just an illusion. We're not really here. Things don't really exist. It's all made up in our minds.
The Matrix.
Yeah, Matrix.
Pretty real without running to a door.
Yeah. The other is reality is self-created. The other is it's self-existent. Or the final is it's created by something else that is self-existent. So we're going to look at each one of those options and see if any of those work. Is it an illusion? Student says to the professor, I'm not sure I even exist. And the professor says, who then may I ask? Who may I say is asking? Like, is there someone really there? Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am, which is trying to tackle this issue of really, is there such thing as an existence? But the reality of it is, you must exist to deny your own existence. It is self-defeating to claim you don't exist and are just an illusion. Illusions require something to experience the illusion. Therefore, reality is not an illusion. So that's pretty easy to tackle, right? So that's not an option. Though many, I mean, we kind of joke saying reality is an illusion, but this is a philosophical concept that is, I mean, you have a ton of academics
Growing.
embracing it, and growing even more and more. And it was a big thing, maybe 200 years ago, and then lost favor and coming back. And so it's an interesting concept that I don't get at all, but they can do that. So the other option, is reality self-created? This is going to be people like Stephen Hawking, who says, because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Okay?
Really?
So he says, because you have things like gravity, it can self-create. Reality, universe can come into existence because of that. But here's the problem. Okay, if there's such thing as self-creation, my screen's not, it's cutting off some stuff there for you, I'm sorry. Says, he would claim that, well, matter exists, particles, there's a quantum vacuum, energy, motion. He said gravity, because gravity exists. Are these nothing? There's something, right? This is nothing. That's not what he says. He's saying gravity is existing, matter exists, and when matter and gravity and all these things come together, then reality will come into existence. But he's preloading it by changing the definition of nothing. He's saying something does, so where do those things come from? So the idea of self-existence doesn't work. Aristotle, over 2,000 years ago, says nothing is what rocks dream about. That's what nothing is, not that there's gravity and that there's particles in a quantum vacuum. So that concept doesn't work. Here's what John Lennox said. Hawking's argument appears to me even more illogical when he says the existence of gravity means the creation of the universe is inevitable. But how did gravity exist in the first place? Who put it there? And what was the creative force behind its birth? Similarly, when Hawking argues in support of his theory of spontaneous creation that it was only necessary for the blue touch paper to be lit to set the universe going, the question must be, where did this blue touch paper come from? And who lit it if not God? So there's lots of problems with that. So that's one problem with self-creation. The second problem is that a thing cannot be ontologically prior to itself. So to create yourself, you must have existed prior to yourself. Self-creation fails as an explanation because it is analytically false. You can't exist prior, so to say you're self-created, that's like saying I caused myself to be born. That doesn't work. You have to be born first. So that's just logically false. So we've got two options down. Two more to go. Jonathan Edwards, the great preacher, said, something exists, nothing cannot create something, therefore a necessary and eternal being exists. That was part of his argument for the existence of God. So we have two options here. Either the universe is what created the cosmos, or there's someone outside of it, an eternal creator, God, who we would describe. So John Lennox again says, there are not many options, essentially just two. Either human intelligence ultimately owes its origin to mindless matter, or there is a creator. It is strange that some people claim that it is their intelligence that leads them to prefer the first to the second. Right? So the option is mindless matter, the universe created intelligence, us, or an intelligent force created us. So which is it? And you would think that scientists would leap to the second or have some kind of force of intelligence, and yet that's not what they're doing. Men like Stephen Hawking are going, no, there's no intelligence behind it. It's just mindless matter that has brought forth intelligence, which doesn't fly well. So which is it? Why think, and this will be one of the arguments, help us in the idea that God had to create, is actually assisted greatly by science. One thing that science has told us is that the universe has a starting point, right? Everything out there right now, if you go back to, even just basic science and saying that there's a Big Bang that occurred at some point. They're saying that there was a time in which it happened, right? That things came into being, and it's been growing ever since. And we'll look at some of those arguments in a second, but science recognizes that the universe is consistently expanding, which means it had to start from something, right? So almost universally accepted that there is a beginning point of the universe. So if the universe had a beginning, then it has not always existed. If the universe hasn't always existed, then something else must happen. Right? If the universe came into existence, then something had to come prior to that. It's said another way, the cosmological argument for God, which is that everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Another way of phrasing this would be similar to the unmoved mover, that if you keep going back, anything that comes into existence or has a starting point has to have something that starts it, right? The domino effect, if you push one domino, all of them go. Well, someone had to push the initial domino. So who is that? Aristotle said that he didn't believe in a personal God, but he said there had to be some kind of ultimate being that did this. It makes no sense to say something happened without it being caused by something else. So why do we think the universe has a beginning? These are the scientific arguments. We won't get into all of those. We'll let one of our science experts, y'all are teachers, some of you know more science than I do, says, say, yeah. Shaking your head like, no. You don't teach the second law of thermodynamics?
No.
You know what that is?
To break that word apart.
Newton, yeah, we've got, so these are 5 arguments for the universe having a beginning. These aren't things that you actually have to engage in necessarily with scientists. They're just generally accepted. One is the second law of thermodynamics, which is that the universe is running down. It's depleting, so it had to have a starting point in which it was fully there. The other is the expanding universe. This is big with the Hubble telescope. One of the key findings that were achieved because of the Hubble, noticing the constant expansion of the universe. And if something's constantly expanding, it used to be smaller. Bellies. Radiation echo, discovered in the 1930s, was evidence that there was something like a Big Bang that occurred. Now, not explaining what occurred in the Big Bang, but that there was a starting point. That's the argument. And then you have to pick apart, okay, what occurred? As Christians, we always do the God spoke and bang, it happened type thing. But there was a starting point. Then you get galaxy seeds. I don't even know what this, it was discovered in the 1990s by Kobe explorer. And then Einstein's theory of relativity proves the universe had a beginning. So all these things, they're just common knowledge. And this is a big thing, I think. Science and faith are not opposed to one another. Like, this is supporting faith. There's nothing contrary about this that we stand up. We don't need to be the church that was back in Galileo and Copernicus time, where they're saying that the Earth revolves around the sun and they're like heretics for it. We don't need to do that. We can say, if it's fact, let's see what it does. And ultimately, some of these actually prove out to point to God, not away from God. So, why think something needs a cause? This is where philosophy comes into it. Well, the alternative is an infinite regress. It's like you keep having the dominoes that they're always going back. Well, that doesn't make any sense. There always has to be a starting point for anything. Things popping into existence from nothing. This has never been observed. The example from the slide said, like a tiger would just pop up into existence. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. It's never happened, never will happen. So why would we think that the universe would do that? Well, I'm going to skip over the quantum vacuum because unless you know quantum vacuum stuff, I don't know. But basically it demands that something else had to exist. It's saying that gravity and things like that. The quantum vacuum is not nothing. And so they're saying that through the quantum vacuum you're able to produce the universe. But the quantum vacuum is something, so it's still not the argument that nothing existed in the universe. There still has to be something there. Same thing with the multiverse, that there's all these different universes going on, and they're all in existence, and we're the one that's real and being experienced, but still that does not explain how, say there is a multiverse, where they come from, right? Yeah, where they come from and what created us out of it, and so I think my computer just decided to go kaput again. See, one of y'all is like streaming radiation or something. It is. So, last week we didn't have this at all. This week we do. So here's what we're going to do, an alternative. You don't have to turn around. I've got a remote.
They ran microwaves.
It is. Dude.
I don't left over radiation from your house.
Yeah.
Leftover radiation for what?
Your house.
My house. What happened?
Yours had a running microwave.
Uh-oh.
It just had to be reset.
Could have been me.
A running microwave with no door?
I had the door open and the microwave was open. Steve thought it was
Are
the
you?
interior.
That
I think it was just the fan.
No, it came from. You used to have it?
No, I don't.
The yard sale
Plugged it
3
back in,
years
it
ago.
worked fine.
I think we brought more stuff back from that yard sale than this.
Now we have the,
No, it actually explains a lot of things. How long has this been happening?
insane.
Wow. I get to the office later today.
All right.
Wow. And I'm sitting full time today, and this is what I get. I'm done.
Why would you say something like that?
I know.
She's coming around.
She's coming around. She's converting. You utter the words.
Might not be converting, but admitting.
Admitting. Oh.
It's amazing what you do for your friends.
It's all that radiation.
Hey, you'll want to get yourself another cookie.
I need something.
Cat right yours.
What? Wow.
All right. So the multiverse doesn't seem to hold. Alexander Vilenkin said, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of the cosmic beginning." Okay? See, we're going to have all kinds of issues here. All right. This is another one. I thought this was an interesting analogy for it. It's called drowning the fish. Spontaneous creation from nothing, quantum vacuums, multiverses. These and other such propositions by naturalistic scientists are an example of drowning the fish. you can use all of the water in the oceans in an attempt to drown the animal, but in the end, it will still be there, affirming its existence and presence. So, that makes sense? It's kind of a weird one, but... All right. Many people do not like the idea that time has a beginning, probably because it smacks of divine intervention, which that's Stephen Hawking. Yeah, he hit it. People don't like it because it is. It's kind of what happened is you get some of the scientists who they figured this out, and then they say, "Uh-oh, what do we do now?" Because now it points to we have to have an explanation for the beginning. And crazy thing is that a lot of the people have just come out and said, I just don't want to believe it. This is one of those. Said there are two possibilities as to how life arose. One is spontaneous generation arising to evolution. So we're not talking about necessarily evolution of animals and things like that. We're just saying how it came into existence. The other is a supernatural creative act of God. There is no third possibility. Spontaneous generation, that life arose from non-living matter, was scientifically disproved 120 years ago by Louis Pasteur and others. That leaves us with only one possible conclusion, that life arose as a creative act of God. I will not accept that philosophically because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which I know is scientifically impossible. Catch that.
He's a scientist.
He's a professor of biology at Harvard. He's won the Nobel Prize in biology. And that's the type of conversation that is somewhat typical from those who have an agenda already, who say, I'm not truly open-minded to whatever is there and what the arguments may be. I'm choosing that this can't exist. And so I would rather take this other alternative, which is why our small group did a study called It Takes More Faith to Be an Atheist. Which is true, because you have to move at this point. You have to say, I'd rather believe what has been scientifically disproven than to believe that there's something outside of science that I can't prove, out of the natural world. J.M. Wersinger said, at first the scientific community was very reluctant to accept the idea of a birth of the universe. Not only did the Big Bang model seem to give in to the Judeo-Christian idea of a beginning of the world, but it also seemed to have to call for an act of supernatural creation. It took time, observational evidence, and careful verification of predictions made by the Big Bang model to convince the scientific community to accept the idea of cosmic genesis. The Big Bang is a very successful model that imposed itself on a reluctant scientific community. So, it's not exactly... It wasn't initially favored, and that's why you now have explanations such as Hawking saying that there's this quantum vacuum or a multiverse theory, because they have to come to terms with the universe started at some point. So what other alternative do you have if you're going to reject God? So now we're going to look at, that leaves us with one option, right? We've said, I'm going to get two here. We said that it can't be the first three, so what other option is there? It can't be that it's an illusion, we proved that. It can't be self-created, we showed that. And it can't be self-existent. Therefore, the only option left is that it was created by something that is self-existent. So what is that? That's something outside of everything else we are dependent on something else for existence. So you have to have something that's outside of that and is purely self-existent, which would be what we define as God. Now, there's some objections to this. One of the most famous is by Bertrand Russell. He kind of went through this process and still came to the conclusion that there was a God, but then rejected it. He said, I may say that when I was a young man and was debating these questions very seriously in my mind, I for a long time accepted the argument for the first cause. Until one day, at the age of 18, I read John Stuart Mill's autobiography, and I there found this sentence. He said, my father taught me that the question, who made me, cannot be answered. since it immediately suggests the further question of who made God. That very simple sentence showed me, as I still think, the fallacy of the argument for the first cause. If everything must have a cause, then God must have a cause. So here he's acknowledging, because Aristotle laid it out, that there needs to be a cause. And so you go back to God and now say, well, then God must have a cause. And I've been there. I've gone to those. I've been in the philosophy classes where I recognize, okay, yeah, I get there. There has to be a cause for everything. And so God is that cause. And what about him? What do I answer about him? The problem with this is it is a category mistake. Because we're saying that God's self-existent, so then to put him into the category of needing something to be in existence changes the definition of who God is. Right. It's like saying, what does the color blue taste like? You can't. Where is the bachelor's wife? Non-existent. Positing a self-existent first cause is philosophically sound. You don't make the unmade. You're saying he wasn't made. So he's self-existent. Now that blows my mind because you can't put it in a frame of reference because you're saying God who operates outside of time has always been here, and I don't think our finite minds can fully fathom that. But it's not appropriate to say, well, he had to have a cause because everything had a cause. Because by doing that, you change him and you lower him away from God, and is just a higher order of creation. And so we're saying he is outside of that and doesn't need that. So let's be honest, then the response is, okay, a self-existent, eternal God, give me a break. That's impossible. And it is hard for our minds to grasp, and I freely acknowledge that. I think the combination of multiple arguments helps, because this one on its own, that's a tough stopping point to say, well, what about God? And so, I get this. I get someone giving this response. An alternative is, okay, so a self-existent eternal universe, what's the difference? I'm saying it's God, you're saying it's a universe. Which one's more believable, right? So that it's not, you still have to have an alternative. You either deny science or you embrace what science says and says it points to that there's something outside of creation. So you have to go with the facts here. The facts say that if you deny a self-existent, necessary, and eternal creator, you must automatically embrace a self-existent, necessary, and eternal universe. Or some combination of the two, which is pantheism, that God is in everything, there's Mother Earth, that type of thing. Every drop of scientific data points to the conclusion that the universe had a beginning and is not eternal. Why is an eternal creator preposterous and an eternal universe not? Perhaps because an eternal universe is an amoral entity who doesn't hold anyone accountable. Might this be behind the rejection of such a belief? If you have a self-existent universe, you don't have to worry about morality. There are no standards. So, what would this first cause be? If you're saying that there's someone behind creation outside of the universe, these are the things that have to be present. The first cause has to be supernatural in nature because it created the natural, so it has to be outside of the natural. It has to be powerful to create this. It has to be eternal, self-existent, so you don't have the infinite regress. It has to be omnipresent to create time and space. It has to be timeless because it created time. Immaterial because it transcends space and time and the physical world. Has to be personal because there's an intent to create. Has to be necessary because everything else depends on it. Infinite because you can't have, and singular, you can't have two infinites, so you can just have one. Has to be diverse yet unified, intelligent, purposeful, moral, or else there's no moral law. It has to be caring or else there would be no need for law. So that's purely philosophical. This is what someone like Aristotle would say, an unmoved mover, some divine being, supernatural being. But if you look at those descriptors, it sounds an awfully lot like what we see in the Bible God described as. Right? God is supernatural, He's powerful, eternal, omnipresent, timeless, immaterial, personal, necessary, infinite, diverse, intelligent, purposeful, moral, and caring. All of those fit God. So, yeah. I like this quote by Robert Jastrow. He says, astronomers now find that they have painted themselves into a corner because they have proven by their own methods that the world began abruptly in an act of creation to which you can trace the seeds of every star, every planet, every living thing in this cosmos and on the earth. And they have found that all this happened as a product of forces they cannot hope to discover. That there are what I or anyone else would call supernatural forces at work. And he said that's now a proven fact. So that's the cosmological argument for God, if you've ever heard that phrase. That there has to be a cause. I'm going to skip through here to our next one. And that cause is best explained through something outside of the universe that brings it into existence. But then you get this concept of the intelligent cause. And I really like this one. It's built on science again, but it's pretty interesting to me when you get into it. Louis Giglio has a big emphasis in this. If you watched any of his videos, there's a big push towards showing this, embracing science and what science has told us, which is that there has to be some kind of intelligent force, that the things that occur when you get down to the cellular level are so impossible, they're so fine-tuned that there has to be someone outside of it. The basis behind this is, if you if you go and look at anything, you can clearly tell. One of the examples will be Mount Rushmore. If you go up to Mount Rushmore, do you look at that and think that that came about naturally, or do you think about that there was an intelligent force behind it? Right? Anything. You go to a car, you can tell what is man-made and what is not man-made, because with the intelligent factor there. So when you look at creation, you look at our bodies, and to think that this came about through chance, it just happened to all fit together, is so improbable that you can't even fathom the number. So that's an overview of where we're going. But
I heard a good explanation once. Our pastor in Atlanta shared it. He said that just it coming into existence and being would be like an explosion in a plant, and you go back and there's a watch that's made out of that explosion.
yeah, it's a good one.
It's
Yeah.
that improbable.
Yeah. And think about it, it is. It's so ridiculous to think that this came about. So, that's a good example of it. So do we recognize intelligence when we see it? Is this from the wind, rain, or time? Obviously not. Same thing even with things that we found in Earth, right? You dig them up and you see that they're arrowheads. We don't think that that was created, immediately recognize civilization, human influence. The same thing with paintings on walls. You can't see those very well, but there's paintings there, or drawings. No reasonable person would conclude that Mount Rushmore, an arrowhead, or a cave painting happened by natural means alone. We naturally are able to differentiate between intelligence and natural causes. It's obvious. We don't need help doing that. We can see which one comes from intelligence. And this leads us to the discussion, I guess, of the principle of uniformity. This states that causes and effects in the past are like causes and effects observed today. And so, if this is true, that if uniformity is there, so what happens now, I build something and it comes into existence, it's the same thing that it had to take place in the past. Things don't change how we do them. It still demands intelligence. If that's true, then we can assume that our own existence our own intelligent or intricate design had to come from intelligence, just like anything we observe now. So, Thomas Aquinas, again, gets the halo thing. Every agent acts for an end, even natural agents. Now, what acts for an end manifests intelligence, but natural agents have no intelligence on their own. Therefore, they are directed to their end by some intelligence. so what he's saying there, he's trying to distinguish between natural and intelligent agents. His first principle, which was that agents act to an end, even natural agents, is a self-evident principle. But the second one says that all things move to some end, so you're progressing. And the third says that whatever lacks intelligence must be directed by intelligence as an arrow toward a target. So an arrow is going to some end, but it has to be directed there. It doesn't go there naturally. And so his conclusion is that all things are directed. Everything that is directed must have some intelligence behind it to get it moving in that direction. So an example would be if you have a fully automated robotic assembly plant, no human is there. Do you say that there's intelligence present? Yeah, it's just one step removed, right? I mean, they're automated and there's no intelligence going on there, but humans had to create those robots, so there's still intelligence present. It just happens to be one step removed. So this is essentially, on your paper, it's called the teleological argument for God. And I've talked enough about teleology probably in sermons that you should know the definition of teleology by now. But since no one comes whenever I preach, I won't hold you to that. Telos is it's a Greek word, just means end or purpose. It's behind a lot of my own personal theology and philosophy. I think that we were designed for a purpose to glorify God. This is where you even get Rick Warren and the purpose-driven church. All of that is behind the idea that humans have purpose. We were designed with a purpose, and so that's what we will look at with this. Sorry, I skipped one. Teleological argument. So this argument basically says that the universe and humankind exhibit marks of intelligence and design, because when you're created for a purpose, you have to be designed in a certain way, right? If I build something, I'm building it for a reason, so it has to have a particular design. So behind every complex design is a designer. The universe has a complex design, therefore the universe has a designer. That's the argument, the way it goes. So then the question is, if we're going to prove that, if that's the argument behind every complex design is a designer, that's a given. That's obvious. Everyone knows that. The second premise is what's the key? Does the universe have a complex design? If it does, then it follows that the third point is true, that it has to have a designer. So number one is clear. Number three is the obvious conclusion, but is two reality. Does the universe show complex design? Yes, obviously, if we're making this argument. Atheists answer, yes, but. So Richard Dawkins says, living objects look designed. They look overwhelmingly as though they're designed. Biology is the study of the complicated things which give the impression of having been designed for a purpose. So you have to revert to this argument that it's just appearance. It looks like it's there, but really they aren't designed. So by chance or by happenstance, things come into existence that give the appearance of design, but really they're not designed. Obviously, that takes a big
Yeah,
leap
you'd
of
probably
faith.
choke if you had to explain the DNA strand and how it's
Exactly.
intricately
Yeah.
different for a blade of grass, a platypus, a moose. You know, that
Yeah.
didn't happen by chance. A 2-year-old didn't throw those
Right.
on a refrigerator and bam, hey, we got grass.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what's cool to me is the farther down you get into it, like to the DNA level, the more this is revealed.
Right.
And you're like, come on. I mean, that when you even read that quote, it makes you think, really? That's like my kid explaining that they shouldn't get in trouble for something. Well, right before this, this is a great example. Micaiah, Matthias, and Atticus were playing out here, being rowdy, and Amber walked in, and I'm seeing it from the table, and I look, and Matthias had just done something and pulled a Matthias, which is being aggressive, and I saw his knee go up, like he was about to knee his brother or kick his brother, something like that. He gets that from Amber. It was about to be violence displayed. Amber immediately, like, she walked in at that moment. And she took his toy and said, go sit down, you know, and got on him and all that stuff. And he said, no, I didn't do it. It just looked like I was about to. Like I was pretending. That's essentially what that argument boils down to, isn't it? Like it looks like design, but it's really not. It's really not. It's really by chance.
It's by chance she saw it at the right time.
Yeah. Anthony Flew said, it seems to me that Richard Dawkins constantly overlooks the fact that Darwin himself, in the 14th chapter of The Origin of Species, pointed out that his whole argument began with a being which already possessed reproductive powers. This is the creature, the evolution of which a truly comprehensive theory of evolution must give some account. So he's saying, with Darwin, I mean, he's looking at creatures that are already in existence, that have already are multiplying and reproducing. So he's not going back to before that. How did they come into existence? He's talking about now that they are in existence. How do they move forward? Darwin himself was well aware that he had not produced such an account. I'm sorry, I skipped a line. This is the creature, the evolution of which is truly comprehensive theory of evolution must give some account. Darwin himself was well aware that he had not produced such an account. It now seems to me that the findings of more than 50 years of DNA research, like you were saying, have provided materials for a new and enormously powerful argument to design. Crick, who is a co-discoverer of DNA, says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Why? Why do you have to keep something in mind? Unless you're preloading it. You've already pre-concluded the presuppositions behind it. You're saying that these can't be the consequences. It has to be something else. So you're already making, in the school that I teach, one of my primary jobs is students work on final projects, and they're research projects and dissertations. And I had one, and he wrote it, and he basically, in chapters 1 and 2, was writing what needed to be done and what his conclusions were before he did any of the actual testing. Like he never went and surveyed people, and he said, well, here's the issues. If they would just do this, if they would just do this. And obviously I took it back to him and said, you already came to your conclusion before you did any of your research. That makes it invalid. I might as well throw out the first 2 chapters you did because you're coming to it with an agenda. And that's what these are doing. I'm doing that with measly doctor of ministry students. These are people teaching in Harvard and Yale, and they're not recognizing it. So it's kind of crazy to me. Darwinian biologists must keep... wrong one. Darwinian biologists must keep repeating that reminder to themselves, because otherwise they might become conscious of the reality that is staring them in the face and trying to get their attention. So what arguments do we have now? Let's look at, is there such thing as design? Can we really look? We say that it's in DNA, we say that there's fine-tuning, it seems obvious, but is there true evidence for this? So we're going to look at 2 lines of argument. One looks at the fine-tuning, the other one looks at specified complexity. The first one of these is the fine-tuning argument, sometimes called the Goldilocks effect. What it does is it purposes the fundamental constants and quantities of nature fall into exquisitely narrow range of values which render our universe life permitting. What it's saying is that our world is set up, and it's so narrow, the things like the tilt of the axis and the ratio of oxygen and nitrogen and hydrogen, everything is so perfectly set up that if any one of those changed slightly, we wouldn't exist. And that's such fine-tuning to allow existence to, humanity to exist, shows that there had to be someone who designed it, who set it all up in this way. This is kind of funny. I know sometimes Christians don't like to talk about global warming and greenhouse effect and all that stuff, but what's behind all that? Why do we care? We care about global warming because if the protective layers, eventually thin out and more of the sun's rays penetrate, raises the temperature of the earth, And if it raises just slightly, all the ice caps melt, everything ceases to exist. So even in that, it's kind of funny that this is one thing that certain people like to beat on, that the earth isn't warming up and we don't need to worry about that and everything. And I'm not worried about that argument so much, but the fact that we care shows that life can only be sustained within narrow parameters, or it'll cease to exist. Well, how did we come into existence in such narrow parameters? And this idea, the fine-tuning argument, says that if any of these were changed even slightly, everything would be upset and would basically lead to our destruction. And so the naturalist would argue that says time, matter, and change is enough that would bring this about, which just seems strange and like such a big stretch to just say time, space, or time, matter, and change eventually could bring about this fine-tuning that allows life to exist. Like it's so narrow that it's irrational. It's insufficient argument for it. So here's some examples of this that we've kind of alluded to. Oxygen currently makes up 21% of the atmosphere. Were it 25%, fires would erupt everywhere, and if it were 15%, humans would suffocate. If gravity was altered by lots of zeros, 1%, the sun would not exist and the moon would crash into the earth. I don't know what that number is even. I mean, I can't quantify what that is, but that much of a percent change, everything would fall apart. If the centrifugal forces of the planetary movements did not precisely balance the gravitational forces, nothing could be held in orbit around the sun. If the universe was expanding at a rate 1/1,000,000th more slowly than it is, the temperature on Earth would be 10,000 degrees. I mean, this isn't Christians coming up. Like, this is just science that shows this. I didn't know this one, though. If Jupiter was not exactly where it is, Earth would be bombarded by space material that would threaten life on this planet. Because it's bigger, because it takes it just crazy, some of this stuff. This is why I love this aspect of the arguments. If the thickness of the Earth's crust was greater, too much oxygen would be transferred to the crust to support life. And if it were thinner, volcanic and tectonic activity would make life impossible. So even that matters. I always think about the heavens, but even the Earth, the way it's designed, matter. The axis of the Earth is set so carefully that if it were altered ever so slightly, surface temperatures on the Earth would be far too great. If water vapor levels in the atmosphere were greater than they are now, a runaway greenhouse effect would cause temperatures to rise far too high on the planet. Life would die out. If they were less, an insufficient greenhouse effect would make life too cold to support life. I mean, this is just like shows that it's perfect order, which is why I think some of the money and things that we do of exploring like Mars and can life be sustained on Mars. Probably not, if you have to have all this stuff, right? I mean, maybe things could happen, but you'd have to have artificial, which if life was on Mars and you have a bubble around it and people are living there, when you look at that and think, oh, it came into existence on its own, or would you say, no, people from another planet went? I mean, you get the point there. So what are the odds of this? Astrophysicist Hugh Ross has calculated the odds of of all anthropic constants and quantities, which there's 122 at last count. Of those things we just said, 122 of those, last count, for those to all be in place for any planet in the universe by luck alone. And the chance would be 1 chance in 10 with 138 zeros after it. This number becomes even more incredible when one realizes there are only 10 to the 70th power atoms in the entire universe. So 10 to the 70th, and now we're saying that 1 in 130. I mean, it's just incredible. As it says, mathematicians show that anything that is 10 to the 50th power is the exact same thing as saying zero chance. So what they're saying basically is that if you have all of those things necessary and you want them to come by chance, you have zero chance of that occurring. So what are the explanations about this fine-tuning? There's three options that you have. This is where, so the answer to this, where we said it leads to the conclusion that there's an intelligent designer, a philosopher or scientist would say, well, no, that we don't have to go there yet. We don't have to go to a supernatural designer, an intelligent designer. And so they say, first option is the physical necessity. So that it had to come into existence. But that doesn't work. If nothing exists, what makes it have to happen? Or what forces everything to align? It just doesn't work. So the constants and quantities could be different. They don't have to be what they are. So it just doesn't work. We said chance doesn't work either. It's mathematically impossible. And the only way is to say there's multiverse, and that we've already shown doesn't work either. There's no empirical data. And so the last option is intelligent designer. It just logically goes forward from that. Stephen Hawking said, the initial configuration of the universe appears to be very carefully chosen. Arno Penzias says, in the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. So that's the argument for the fine-tuning. That's not even looking at us. That's not looking at the complexity of what we are. That's just saying life is able to be sustained because of atmospheric entities and the earth composition. We're not looking at DNA yet. That's this argument, which is the argument for the specified complexity. It says that nature and life could contain the imprint of an intelligent cause with evidence such as DNA bearing the marks of a designer. Basically, the purpose is that life is encoded with information that demonstrates an intelligent cause. Now let me just say this. If you watched Louis Giglio's videos, he has one that at the end it talks about, if you peer into the universe, you'll see a design of the cross or something like that. Have you seen that?
Yeah, that's pretty bad.
That's not what this is saying. That's like a college, woo, God exists type thing that's not really valid. Like, we're going to look at something and there's an appearance of a cross, so God exists. That's cool, but that's not exactly what this is saying. This is saying when by imprint we're not saying a cross, we're like the shroud of Jesus or or Mary or whatever. We're saying that you look at something and it's so complex that you say, yeah, it's showing that there was someone behind this that designed it. So let's look at this. Atheists like Richard Dawkins admit that the message found in just the cell nucleus of an amoeba, right? Just what, a single cell organism, is that right? Is more than all 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica, which no one even owns anymore. But I wanted to say more than Wikipedia. The entire amoeba itself, that's just the nucleus. The entire amoeba itself has as much information in its DNA as 1,000 complete sets of the Encyclopedia Britannica. The important thing to understand is that the makeup of these entities is not random. It'd be one thing if there were just like data everywhere and it was jumbled up. It'd be like we have all the letters in the world and they're just poured out on page, but we're saying, no, it's not just that they're random, there's actually order to them. It'd be like getting 1,000 sets of the encyclopedia and reading it. That's how much information is in one cell. And it's ordered in that way. It's highly organized. So, yes?
I just thought I should jump in and ask you this, and because maybe this is a false notion, but when we talk about cosmology and the Kalam theory and all those things, that's primarily about the existence of the earth, of the world. But now, really, what makes it even more unbelievable is now you have to explain the existence of all living things on the earth. So now you've multiplied the unlikelihood of anything remotely close to what we're talking about. So to me, it's just, you just went from one massive leap to talk about the universe, and now you've got to make an equally gigantic leap for human life.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you want to get to the human life. Now, if you can get to the universe existing, then you can jump over to evolution and say, okay, well, now we have to dissect evolution to get, whether humanity's there or not. But if there's a God, then you don't even need that. And so, I mean, yeah, this isn't even tackling those arguments. This is just, if there's anything in existence in the universe, much less humanity, now it's like ratcheting it up that times 50 exponential. It's crazy. Which, I want to make this point, which is what I said a second ago, which is that data and information are different things. Data is just random letters and numbers. We're talking information that actually tells you something. It's a plan for how things operate. It's instructions. And that's what we have when you look at the cellular level of things. So, the Scientific American said, ask anybody what the physical world is made of, and you're likely to be told matter and energy. Yet if we have learned anything from engineering, biology, and physics, information is just as crucial an ingredient. You can't just have all this stuff randomly. Try to put things together. If you have parts, they don't just go together. You have to have instructions of how they fit together. You need that information. So let me jump to some of these here. DNA, it said, basically resembles software design, which is crazy. I can't fathom designing software and all that's needed to encode all the lines of code. Tried to do it. I mean, it's extensive. And you're saying that's present in DNA. I mean, that kind of information that gives a script of what will happen, how things will progress. So I'm going to jump to this one here. Let's see if I can get there. I skipped one more. DNA is mathematically identical to a language. What language has ever arisen without intelligent cause? Think about that. Does language just happen? There's intelligence behind it. Micaiah, he's trying to learn sign language right now. And you have to have a book, right? You have to have that information. Francis Collins says, investigations of many organisms, from bacteria to humans, revealed that this genetic code by which information in DNA and RNA is translated into protein is universal to all known organisms. No Tower of Babel was to be allowed in the language of life. How deeply satisfying that is to the digital elegance of DNA. I mean, it's just absurd. Let me show you this picture. All right, if you look at this and the complexity of this figure, you think, okay, yeah, someone made that. That's artwork. And it is. It's a window. It's a stained glass. And then you look at the complexity of that, the beauty of that, and you say, no, that's actually just part of DNA. And that's chance, though, or that had to occur. I mean, it doesn't make sense, obviously. So that's the second. So we've got. I'm going to rush through that's basically that there's a intelligent design. So we've said there's cosmologically there has to be a cause, which shows there's a God. Now we have such fine-tuning of the universe, and the complexity of human life proves that there's a designer. And then you add on to it the third argument, and there's like 6 of these. We're not going to go through all of them. I'm going to stop here with this one, which is the moral one. As an ethicist, I like the other ones because of all the science stuff. I think that's cool, but I love the moral argument. This is what C.S. Lewis used in his Mere Christianity. It's actually what helped him come to know Christ, was that he said there's morality. If there's such thing as morality, where does it come from? So does true right and wrong exist, or is everything relative? Well, if true right and wrong exist, where does it get its basis? That's your option. It's either all relative or you have to have a basis for it. And when you get into those conversations, then the basis is in postmodernism, it's what we as a community have decided on. That's what morality will be. But how do we come to that determination? Who's to say that? And how do we reach that common place? Nietzsche says, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, it does not exist." For a guy who's very popular, he's not very smart. Think about these ideas, and I know these aren't very fun to think about. Are these sometimes wrong or always wrong? Torturing babies for fun. The Indian practice of widow burning. Priest abusing children and church authorities covering it up. Rape. Murder of innocent people. In any world, in any possible reality, are those sometimes okay? Are they just sometimes wrong, or are they universally wrong? Right? We don't have to think about that. That's so ingrained in us. I mean, we don't, not ingrained, that's the wrong word, because ingrained means it's taught. Like, it's obvious that those things, there's no culture that celebrates those. It's not okay in any culture. It exists. So how do we know that? How does that come into existence? Another person who's not exactly bright in some regards says, Oscar Wilde said, "Nothing succeeds like excess. Nothing is good or bad, only charming or dull." So he's claiming, like, nothing in the world is bad or good, or bad or evil, or good or evil, sorry. He's just saying, it's just, some is charming, we like some of it's just dull. And this is kind of a crude response to that, but are atrocities like what was done in World War II, is that charming or dull, or do you get a sense that that is wrong? Like morally reprehensible? Obvious. Few people truly deny that acts are morally wrong. If you say that there's no morality, you're saying there's no objective values. A lot of people want to espouse that, but they don't really believe it. They don't really do it. All you have to do is go up to them and hit them, and they say, "Well, you just wronged me." Well, how? Right? Or I stole what you had. "Oh, you just got, let me see your wallet. I'm going to take $100. I'm going to go, that was wrong." Well, hi. Why? Who says? There has to be some objective standard to do this. You have to, and to have objective moral values, you need a standard and an authority. One is the measure, and the other one who's going to impose that and enforce it on people, which we would say is God, obviously. I love C.S. Lewis's explanation. A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. And that's how that's one of his key arguments for God's existence. Is that how do we tell if something is better or worse than anything else? And he uses a great illustration of, like, if we're going to draw a city. If Ted and I got up here and drew a picture of New York City, all of you would look at that and say, well, like, you could judge which one's better, which one's worse. Well, how would you be able to judge that? Because you know what New York City really looks like, right? If I draw a bunch of buildings that are this big and he's drawing skyscrapers, you'd all say Ted's picture's better because it corresponds to what you know to be true. Well, do we make moral judgments about things? Yeah, we know things are better or worse. Well, how can we make such judgments unless there's some standard by which they're measured? So all of us, I think, would say we are better people, or we have a better human values than Hitler, right? I mean, all of us would say we've progressed better than Nazi Germany, morally speaking. How do you define better? There has to be if you're progressing to something better, then there has to be an ideal form of morality. So what is it? You have to have an explanation for that. So you have to have that standard by which to measure, which would be something outside of this. You can't say we're better than Hitler and Nazi Germany because we decided to be better. No, you say we're better because we treat people better. Right? We're not murdering people, Jewish people, or whatever, and we're not experimenting on people. Like we're just, it's obvious because there's a standard. So there's a key distinction in this, and that is what's the difference between ontological and epistemological. The ontological is what's the source. The epistemological is how do you come to that knowledge. We care about the ontological, which is what's the source of truth? What's the source of morality? Not how did I come to know it necessarily, like was I taught it by my parents? Did someone, did society come together and agree to something? We want to know what's the standard by which they judge all this by. And this is kind of like that other argument. There's 4 options. It's either from the universe, from society, from the individual, or from a creator. Well, those are real easy to go through. If it's from the universe, how can something that has no personality, is nothingness, create ought-ness? What should be done, or what should not be done? That doesn't make any sense, right? How can an amoral or amoral, impersonal, meaningless, and purposeless universe accidentally create personal moral beings who are obsessed with meaning and purpose? So, can't be I'm going to skip some of these. It can't be the universe. What about culture? Well, that's a bad option. I'll read through this. It's somewhat small print, but it says in Kenya, the practice of beating is carried out. It's a close family relative of a young girl places a strand of beads around the young girl's neck. This effectively is a temporary engagement, and the relative can now have sexual relations with her. Some girls are beaded when they're as young as 6 years old, which is obviously we're cringing at this now. Many young girls get pregnant and either have abortions or kill their babies at birth. When they reach adulthood, the girls will marry outside of their village. But taboo dictates the girls will never be able to marry if they keep their babies resulting from beating. So when you hear all that, I mean, Renee shaking her head. It's hard for me. I almost stripped that out because I was like, this is just too reprehensible to me. Is it right or wrong?
Wrong.
Well, yeah. I mean, if culture is the definer of truth, is the definer of what's morally acceptable, then that's fine. Beating is okay because culture says it's okay in their culture. Cannibalism's okay. Murder's okay. Unforgiveness, rape, all those. You can't just say any of those are wrong for a culture because whatever that culture decides. And none of us would be okay. That's as if we're saying what Hitler did is okay because that culture said that was okay. And we find that obviously reprehensible. A judge at the Nuremberg trial said, they said that was basically their argument. This was acceptable. This is what we thought. It was according to our law. And he said, but sir, is there not a law above our laws? That was a good concept. So even if it is culture, what or who are we obligated to? You think about the idea, it's called the reformer's dilemma. We say that things reform and get better. How can you do that if there's no determiner of good or evil? So that leaves us with 2 other options, the individual or God. So if it's an individual, how do you determine if my way or Keith's way is correct? How do you decide which one's a good thing and an evil thing if they're opposed? We would have to be okay with the statement, for me, rape is wrong, or for me, murder is wrong, or for me, abuse is wrong, but for you, it's okay. How does that sound to you, right? I mean, that's against our comprehension. Even the most relativistic person said that, truth is relative, you define reality. No one would accept this. But that's the consequences of it. That's the only option you have because we've said culture and universe can't do it, so now it's left up to the individual. The problem with individuals, everything boils down to emotion, and that doesn't work. So, this is what you're left with. Again, Bertrand Russell, not a great person to follow after, In his debate with the atheist Bertrand Russell, the Jesuit and philosopher Frederick Copleston looked at Russell and asked, "Lord Russell, do you believe in good and bad?" Russell replied, "Yes." Copleston continued, "How do you differentiate between good and bad?" Russell replied, "The same way I differentiate between blue and green or yellow and green." Copleston then said, "Wait a minute, you differentiate between yellow and green by seeing, don't you?" Russell said, "Yes." So Copleston challenged him by asking, "How do you differentiate between good and bad?" And Russell replied, "I differentiate on those matters on the basis of my feelings." What else? Then you say, well, where do those feelings come from? What's that based on? So the truth of it, the fact behind this is that relativists demand absolutes. The most relativistic person still has to have some absolutes. Watch how they act when you wrong them. If you do something wrong, they want justice and they say that was morally wrong. They want vengeance. They want compensation for a wrong. So that doesn't work. So science, another one, science can't tell us what's correct. You can't have something that's out without personality telling us what's right and what's wrong. So that leads us, we get universe doesn't work, society doesn't work, the individual doesn't work, so there must be a transcendent creator. So here's the basic argument. Laws imply a lawgiver. There's an objective moral law, which we established already. Therefore, there's a moral lawgiver. That's the argument for the existence of God. Another way of phrasing this is, if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties don't exist. Do objective moral values and duties exist? Am I called to care for someone if they're hurting? Am I called to treat someone with respect? Is that a clear designation? Yes, we'd say values and duties exist. Therefore, God exists. And that's the logic, that's the argument for the existence of God from morality. So we have cosmological, design or teleological, and now the moral argument. And I think on the basis of those three things, you can show pretty definitively, even if one isn't taken, now you're bringing in three arguments that point to God. So then we say, well, the Bible, I don't believe the Bible. Well, what about science? Science shows that there's design and that there needs to be something behind it. Philosophy, what about philosophy? Philosophy shows that there has to be a cause of everything. Even morality shows that there has to be someone behind all this. So it doesn't work. These show that there's a God. We are out of time and didn't get to now the Bible and Jesus and resurrection apologetics, but I kind of figured that because that's the nature of this. It's an 8-week course normally, and we had 2 nights. So we'll talk about finishing it up at a later time. If you're interested in doing that and now looking at, especially in Steve's wheelhouse, some of the scripture, the support for scripture, and showing that scripture is, like, you can prove the authenticity of scripture and that it's not just made up legend. And then I'd like to get into even proving the resurrection, how that's done. Which then leads you to is, why does bad things happen when there's a good God, and don't all roads just lead to the same place in pluralism? So we may eventually have a couple of nights where we can round it out.
It sounds like one of those David flag, what do they do, like
Secret church
all
thing,
night?
yeah.
This is gonna
So let me. Do you,
It's good with me.
I'll pray for us unless anyone has a question. I don't know that any. Oh, we don't have kids in here, so no one else has kids to rush.
Are you sugared them up? They can stay.
Yes.
I do have one. Most of the time that you encounter someone and engage them, I've noticed, at least with me, is that if you sometimes when you answer their question, they really honestly don't know what to ask. They're trying to not trying to irritate you. They just don't know what to ask. And so what they may do is allow you to get part of your answer out, and when they realize, hey, this guy has an answer for this, they'll switch to the next thing and the next thing. And what I found in that is it's very difficult to not come across as argumentative when you have to say, well, now please understand that we're leaving the argument we were just talking about, and now you're going to a new place, and are you sure you want to do that? Because now these are two totally separate matters. You know, we were talking about the cosmological existence of God, and now, you know, we're really talking more about relativism. Or now we're talking about the authority or the reliability of the scriptures, or etc. You know, I mean, we want to do it with gentleness and love and respect. But is it ever okay to maybe suggest to them what perhaps they should be asking? Because oftentimes
I
they're
think
not
it is.
really asking
Yeah.
the right question.
I think it is. I think that's part of the. I mean, you guide the conversation in it. I mean, you know, depending on the level of their abilities. But I agree. I mean, we often face that where it's, you know, almost dumbfounded. Where do I go from here? Well, now let me show you where you can go from here, and hopefully we eventually are able to point them to Christ in that process. And so, because and to be clear, I think what you said was perfect, that you've got to make sure that they understand when we're switching arguments and when we're moving around where we are in this conversation. And I think by doing that, you help control it a little bit more and keep it from being argumentative and be more like a teaching endeavor. Unless someone studied it, they're probably just like TV personality railing against something or a Facebook post against God and not really knowing the full implications. So I would say, yeah, we guide them through that conversation if they're receptive. You know, sometimes they won't. One of the things you often hear about these in the true debates is basically they come to an impasse because they say, "Yeah, I'm just not willing to accept that." I get what you're saying, legitimately. Like that was in the book that we went through. I don't have the faith to be an apologist or to be an atheist. The guy said, "Yeah, I just don't want to." I said, "Okay, just know, like, I don't have an answer for your question. There is none." And so, you know, I think we drop it when we need to drop it, but then we press it when we need to press it. So. All right, yeah, they're getting a little rambunctious. I'll pray for us. God, I thank you for, thank you that you are a good God and that we have moral standards, that you've given us that in our hearts and in our minds, that we know you exist. It's clear evidence and that you've created a moral sense in us that we know right and wrong. I pray that we be responsible with that. But God, I pray we're also responsible in those conversations that we have with others. Let us be able to communicate clearly, help us to understand what we believe, why we believe it, and be responsible with the tools you've given us. Bless us this week as we go, and let us think on deep things about you as we grow deep in our relationship with you. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen.
Amen.
All right.
Thanks, Mike.